All right, how you guys doing? Woo! Awesome. So my name is Rami Sayar, and today I'm going to be speaking about what's new in ECMAScript 6 for web developers. So on the agenda, what is ECMAScript 6? Maybe some of you have never heard that term before. We're going to learn about some of the cool features that are proposed in the standard, among them block scoping, destructuring, modules and classes, and iterators and generators. So I'll be covering all of that awesome new stuff that's coming. And I'm assuming that you all know at least a little bit about JavaScript, right? Let's get a show of hands. How many of you guys are JavaScript developers? Everyone. That's amazing. Awesome. Okay. So the slides will be available. If you want to get them right after this talk ends, just follow my Twitter handle, and I will have already scheduled a tweet that will send them all out to you. So my name is Rami Sayar. I'm a technical evangelist at Microsoft, and my job is to really work with developers, work with startups, work with students, and figure out how we can help them build their technologies. And what I focus on is web and open source. So I'm based in Montreal, so I'm very implicated in the Montreal startup community and the developer community, but I love coming out to FITC, love coming out to Toronto because you guys got some really awesome talent here, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. So let's first think about this. Why should I care? Well, I think it's because JavaScript is now everywhere. Everywhere you go, JavaScript is there. IoT devices. Node.js is on the Raspberry Pi. You can get it on the Raspberry Pi. The web, both front end, back end. You've got mobile apps you can build with PhoneGap. JavaScript, all the things. All right? All the things. So it's everywhere. And as a result, the future of JavaScript is something that's extremely important. And that we need to know what's coming. We need to take a look at what the standards teams are building. And as a result, if you want to stay relevant in the JavaScript world, you got to stay up to date because it is an awesome world now, and you can use your skills and your language knowledge everywhere you go. And I've seen the future. It's in my browser. Everywhere I go, all right, I've been using the different browsers out there. I've seen the future. It's already in the browser. You can get it right now. You can use some of the ECMAScript 6 features that I'm going to show you in the browser right to this day. And let me tell you, it's just awesome. All right, we're making the future, and it's happening now, and you can get started right away. But first, what is ECMAScript? You guys have heard of ECMAScript? How many of you have? A few of you guys? Okay, cool. For those of you who haven't, ECMAScript is the official language of JavaScript. It's the scripting language that was standardized by the ECMA International Corporation. It's a standard-setting body. And essentially, ECMAScript implementations are most commonly known as JavaScript, and there's a few other ones like JScript and ActionScript. And it's JavaScript, as you most probably know already, is most commonly used in the browser, but as I've said already, it's now everywhere. So speaking of ECMAScript, where is it now? Well, we're at ECMAScript 6, and I guess that's why you're here today. It's scheduled for release around the mid-2015 period, so very, very soon. We're already in April, so that's June is coming really quick. And it's proposing a bunch of different things. And among them is various different language features and some new syntax. If you look at the history of ECMAScript, we've had version 1. That was the first time that JavaScript was ever introduced to the world. And the first edition of ECMAScript was the first standard that we set. And since then, we've been building on top of it a few versions. Well, one version in particular was abandoned, just because no one could agree on what it was supposed to be. But I think we're all very happy with what's coming with ECMAScript 6. And it's targeted for ratification in June 2015. And it's going to be a significant update to the language. There's major JavaScript engines that are implementing these features as we speak. And I'll share this slide deck, and you can actually go check out a few of the status tables. They look something like this. Basically a lot of red dots and green dots all over the place. But different browsers are implementing different features first. So it's coming, and different browsers already have these features built in, so you can use them. And if you're wondering, well, how do I actually get ECMAScript 6? If you are running Chrome Canary, you just got to go to Chrome-flags and then enable the experimental JavaScript. If you're running IE, I don't know if any of you are, but IE 11 has the most complete ECMAScript 6 support, so that's the new Project Spartan that we're releasing fairly soon. the new browser, it actually has a very good ECMAScript 6 support, and I'll show you which ones it does support and which one it doesn't. And of course, if you are a Firefox lover, you've got the Firefox Nightly or the Developer Edition that's getting all these different features as the updates come in. Now, of course, but if you're a Node developer, I did say that JavaScript is now everywhere. If you're building web apps with JavaScript on the back end, you can get a lot of these new features now as well. If you're using Node, all you got to use is the --v8 -options and pass in the Harmony flag. Harmony is the nickname of ES6. And that will enable quite a bit of features, and I'll cover some of the features that are going to be enabled in this talk. But there's one that was implemented already in Node, but is not going to be part of the standard, and that's the type of one, the type of feature, and that's going to be dropped from the standard. So without further ado, we've been talking about all of these new things that are coming to JavaScript. Let's actually take a look at all of them. And the first one that I want to cover is block scoping. So I don't know about you, but scoping in JavaScript is a little odd, right? Like it's actually at the function level. So a very simple line of code like this, where we have var foo declared twice, doesn't print the right thing. All right, well, it seems if you come from a C language or a Java or C# or any of those languages, it doesn't seem to print the right thing. If you actually wrote this code right now, when you go to check the value of foo inside your if statement, it'll actually print bar. But then if you go after that, it'll print bar again, when in fact it's in theory is not in the same scope, right? Okay. If you look at this, var foo, you set it as FITC, you would think that this new variable that we declared will stay within this scope right here, and it won't actually continue, right? Well, wait, what? It actually doesn't seem to carry the scope. And that's because scoping in JavaScript is at the function level. So what's really happening in the scripting language runtime is that all of these var foo declarations, they're being put at the top. Okay, so if you declare var foo, even inside an if statement, another block of code, another scope in theory, it actually has already been declared at the top. So that same variable is at the top. So if you look at the two code samples, on one side, you declare var foo inside the if statement. What's actually happening is on the other side. So it's not being redeclared. And that's because in JavaScript right now, there is all the scope for every single piece of code that you have is at the function level and not at the block statement level. And what are block statements? Like ifs, for loops, stuff like that. And this feature of JavaScript that has confused many, many people and that has rendered me to tears several times, it's called hoisting. That's the name of the concept. Essentially, what it means is that every single variable that you declare is taken to the top of the function level. All right, so that's where it's taken. They're hoisted to the top, even if that variable never actually gets executed. Funny feature of the language. If you understand that this is happening, you can actually enforce it with some of the linting tools that you have, like JSLint. You can pass it an option that will then force one variable at the top of every single function, because that's fundamentally where JavaScript is doing. So if I wanted to actually take a look at this, how can I get the scope that I want, right? Like if I wanted that if statement to actually contain its own scope, well, the way that I have to do that in JavaScript right now is to create another function. And wrap this piece of code inside that function, because that's how I can create a scope in JavaScript. Well, I'm very happy to say ECMAScript 6 changes this. I hope you're as excited as I am about this. It sounds like a very minute detail, but oh my god, it's going to fix so many of our debugging problems. ECMAScript 6 introduces this new keyword called let and const. Variables declared with let are bound to the lexical environment as opposed to the variable environment. So what that means is that they're actually bound to that code block, that block statement that you've got, that if, that for loop, as opposed to the variable environment, which is the function level. All right, so variables declared with let are scoped to the block statement. And this is very similar. It's actually exactly the same as some of the other languages that you might be familiar with, like Java, C++, C#, and a bunch of other ones. So it would look like something like this. If I wanted to take my foo example, and I had my if statement, all I do is I change the the var, and replace it with a let, and you can do that any place where you can write var, you can replace it with a let. If you do that, then there's no more hoisting of the variables to the top. So I can have let foo outside of my if statement, and in my if statement I have let foo again, and it will actually print the right thing this time. At least what I was hoping it would print. Okay? So this is one of the big changes that's coming with block scoping. And what's interesting is that let is one of the statements, but there's also const, and that's also a scope to the block. And what const does, and what it stands for is constant, is essentially saying this variable is constant, and when I declare it, I'm going to set the initial value, and I can't change it. And that's going to fix so much problems when it comes to debugging. Because I can say this variable is constant, and it's going to be scoped to my block. So if I have const foo, and then let foo inside my if statement, that's okay. Because, again, it's scoped to the block, not to the function. It's currently in. Now, if you do that, though, if you try to set foo to bar again anywhere in that same block, you actually get a syntax error. And that's because you're trying to assign a variable to a constant variable, a new value to a constant variable. So that's what's really awesome about block scoping. It's really there to fix a lot of the problems that we have when we're writing code, because we forget that, hey, this scoping is to the variable environment. And sometimes you get lost. You're writing code, you're not quite sure what the execution context is. If you're not wary of what the variable environment is, it may not even be the function that you're in. Right? The variables that you have access to may not even be that function level. And that's with this new let keyword, by using block scoping, we're going to hopefully fix a lot of the JavaScript errors that we have, and we'll make testing a lot easier as well. You won't have any of these variables leaking out to the global environment and the other functions that you're executing. So that's block scoping. Really cool new feature. The next one I want to talk about is destructuring. Now, destructuring, it's one word that actually means like a couple of different things. And what it lets you do is quite powerful. If you've come from a Python background, you'll notice there's a couple of things in there that you'll actually recognize. And that's because the ECMAScript guys, the standard setting bodies, have actually taken a look at some of the other languages and have borrowed some of the features. And destructuring is one of them. Essentially what destruction means is that it's a syntax feature that allows you to pattern match values to variables or properties. So I have two examples on the screen right now. I have var and then this array, and I'm setting it equal to another array. With destructuring, what that's going to do is it's going to set every single individual variable in my array to the value that I'm setting it on the other side. So I'm destructuring this array, both of these arrays, and then assigning the values and pattern matching the two together. So if I actually print this, I'm going to get bar foo 3. Right? And this code at the top is equivalent to this code at the bottom, where I'm individually setting each up. That's what's actually happening. It's a syntax feature. It doesn't change the JavaScript runtime very much, but when you're executing this new syntax, that's actually what it's being converted to. That's what's actually happening. Now, this new syntax feature allows you to do some really fun things. You can actually swap variables like in Python. So let's say that I had this foo bar, and then on the other side I had bar foo. Clearly I've reversed it. Haha, very clever. What I can do to swap these two variables is quite easy. I can just, hey, destructure one of them and then set the other one to itself, but switch the values. So I can say foo bar is now equal to bar foo. And because I switch the values, when I print it again, it's going to say foo bar. All in one line. Previously, you have to create a temporary variable and then copy one of the values into that before you can swap. Now with this destructuring feature, you can all do it in one line. So you can swap things. It's very Pythonic and very awesome. I like it a lot. Now, it's not only limited to arrays. You can actually apply this destructuring feature to objects as well. And that's actually really powerful, because all of a sudden, you can assign other objects, okay, to one object that I'm going to name all the different properties of. So in this case, I'm going to take an AST node, so the AST node that you get for a specific part, and I'm going to set it to this object. And then I'm going to be able to actually call this object as well. So I'm going to be able to take op A. So I'm going to be able to take A. I'm going to be able to take the B variable. I'm going to be able to take the C variable. And whatever it was in AST node, that function, whatever it was returning, it's going to be assigned into my object. Pretty powerful stuff right there. Now, if you take it a step further, what that means is that you can actually use it to name parameter positions. And that's really awesome. Because I can take parameters to functions, all right, and define how the object is. All right, so I can take function G, I can write function G and say, this function takes a parameter of an object where it has a name and this other parameter called x. All right, so when I call this function, I have to pass in an object, all right, where it has the key name and some value 5. And when I go ahead and do a console log of that x, I'm going to get 5. That's really cool. And you can actually nest more key and values in that object, and you can have a very well-defined object that you're passing as a variable. Now, another neat thing about this is that it's also fail-soft. So when you have a variable that's undefined, all right, you can actually, when you're doing a destructuring, if you don't match, okay, it's not going to crash your program. So if I have an array of A and then I'm setting it equal to an array that's empty, it's not going to crash. It's just going to set it to undefined, just like you would if you're referencing a variable that's undefined. So this was really cool. But what's also even more cool is that you can set defaults too. So you can say A is equal to 1, all right, and I can use that as the parameter to a function, and whatever I pass, if I don't pass the correct amounts of parameters, that's okay, because I've already set the default, okay, and it won't be replaced with undefined. So you can use it to better define, not only can you use it to do really cool syntax tricks, okay, but you can also use it to define your interfaces for your functions quite more clearly and quite more deliberately. So you don't have to have if something is not undefined and has a value at the beginning of every single function. You have to write that right now. You don't have to do that. You can set defaults. Which is pretty cool. The next thing that I want to talk about is modules and classes. So before I do that, I have to mention this has been my experience with JavaScript. I've had milk that lasts longer than some of the JavaScript frameworks that come out. And it's been ridiculous, to be honest, especially the last year or so, how many new frameworks comes out. But this problem of let's fix JavaScript has been going on for years. Okay? And one of the things that's very common is that everybody decides, hey, my framework is going to have some new way to do object-orientedness in JavaScript. I don't know if that's because other languages implement object-oriented notions differently, but everyone has wanted to do that to JavaScript too. We don't really like the way that prototypes have been set as the way to do object-oriented concepts in JavaScript. So everybody's been trying to fix that, and like MooTools did it first, and then you had YUI, and then you had Prototype, and then you had Dojo, and all of a sudden CoffeeScript came out, and they're like, hey, we're going to have a different class. All right, and then there's TypeScript, and they've all been trying to solve the same thing. They all want their own version of how the object-orientedness in JavaScript should work. Well, I'm very happy to say that with ECMAScript, we're adding classes. And this is what it's going to look like. Very similar to what you would expect. The class keyword is going to be used, obviously. It would be really funny if we used something else. It would probably cause a lot of trouble, too. We're going to actually borrow the extends keyword. Okay? So you're going to be able to extend from another class, all right, when you're creating a new class. You're going to have the ability to create a constructor. And this constructor will just be called constructor. Quite simple. We like simplicity in the JavaScript world. You're also going to be able to call the inherited function using the keyword super, which is pretty cool. You're going to be able to set class variables using the this. And the this will always have the context of the class, which is pretty cool. That's something that is going to be part of the language for sure. Now, if you're wondering, well, how do I add a method? Well, it's going to be a little bit different. You're going to just have the assignment identifier, so just the name of the method, and that's a method. All right, and then you can still do super.update if you wanted to. If you wanted to set a getter and a setter, well, we have new keywords for that: get and set. And the really neat thing about the get and set is that it's actually the same thing as the regular method. You don't have to specify a variable because this is JavaScript. All right. Just by setting get, that's what you convert that method into an actual getter. And this will basically look like properties of the class. But in fact, whenever you're trying to set that property or you're trying to get that property, it's actually going to execute these functions, which is pretty cool. The other thing that we're also going to add is this notion of static methods. And this is something that is going to be really foreign for a lot of JavaScript developers because we've never had this notion of static methods, right? But you can and will be able to do it, and the way you can do that is by using the static keyword, and one use case of that could be to return a new instance of an object. For example here, new 3.Node.js. This is an example using 3.js, which is a very awesome game library, if you've used it before. The other thing that we're also going to do is bring in modules in ECMAScript 6. Modularization is a very important software architecture concept, right? And then there's been plenty of attempts to implement modules in JavaScript. CommonJS, you guys heard of CommonJS? Yeah, there's been asynchronous module definition, so AMD. There's been hundreds of different implementations of all of these patterns. All right, Node.js has a built-in module system, and then there's a bunch of libraries that will allow you to do the same thing that you can do in Node.js in the browser. ECMAScript 6 modules will borrow the best concepts from CommonJS and AMD. And the neat thing about the module system is that it's going to be defined by the JavaScript host. Whether that's the browser or Node, they're going to define how this module system is going to work. And the other thing that you got to realize that it's implicitly asynchronous loading. So in other words, whenever you say, hey, load this or import this new module, it's going to load it asynchronously, but it's not going to execute any code until that module has finished loading. So it's not synchronous in the sense that you got to load one module after another. It's asynchronous, but it won't execute anything until all of the modules are loaded. And there's two keywords that are going to be introduced: import and export. Export, obviously, if you've perhaps seen Node.js, you'll recognize this. It's the way that we're going to export something out of a module. Let's say that I created a math.js file. All right. If I want to export the variable of pi, I would just write export var pi. And if I wanted to export a function called add, I would call export function add. And if I did this, all right, and I've exported all of these functions, when it comes to importing it from another file, perhaps app.js, all right, I can use the star notation, import star as math. So this is something that's borrowed from Python, from math, this file, math.js. If I do that, then I can execute code like this: math.add, math.py, math.py, and if I wanted to do it again from another file, and I didn't want to import everything, I can actually import something very specific functions from this module that's being exported. So in this case, I can import the circle area function and pi, all right? And what's neat is that we're also using destructuring here. So we're using this new concept that we introduced in Destructuring in the import statements. Now, what makes the module system extremely powerful is that there's also an API for it. So you can programmatically load modules like you do in AMD with system.import, okay? So you can tell from your JavaScript code to import a bunch of these modules. So you can do dynamic importing and a bunch of other cool things. And why is this important? It's because it lets you customize how your modules are mapped to files. Okay? Let's say that I wanted to map, as opposed to a file on my local system, something in a CDN. So whenever I wanted to load a module, I can say, hey, import this thing. And because I've customized my module loader function, all right, I've customized the import function, it's going to then go to a CDN as opposed to the default site that I'm in, or the default file system that I'm in. So that's something that you can do. And you can also make it so that you can automatically lint modules whenever you import them. That's pretty neat. You can also automatically compile CoffeeScript and TypeScript. You could do anything that can be done in JavaScript whenever you're loading these modules. And of course, if you wanted to stay with the existing module system that you have, you can just use other module systems as your import function. So you can keep that legacy component as well. Now, talking about all of these new classes and modules, well, who's actually supporting it? Well, happy to announce that React.js has announced that they're going to have class support. So you're going to be able to inherit from classes in React.js, which is pretty awesome. AngularJS as well, they've said that, hey, the next version of AngularJS is going to be written in ECMAScript 6. So we've got it. Now, the last feature that I think is extremely powerful, and I absolutely can't wait to have, is iterators and generators. What's an iterator? We've never had this in JavaScript, but if you come from a Java background or a C# background, you've had iterators, or even C++. An iterator is an object that knows how to access items from a collection. This is a very textbook definition, one at a time, while keeping track of the current position in that sequence. So in JavaScript, an iterator is going to be an object that has a next method, and that's what's going to return the next item in the sequence. So all that means is that there's a new way that I can access the items in the collection, and that collection could also be an object. So here's an example where I use an object. I create this var object, this new variable for iterator and a pair, okay, and I create this object called foobar and then conference FITC. Well, the neat thing about this is that I can take that object and wrap it in an iterator. So there's going to be this new function called iterator, and that's going to return an iterator to my object. Now, to actually go through this collection, all I need to do is call it, well, actually, that's a mistake in the slides, iterator.next. Okay? And if I did that, it would return, for the first time, foobar, for the key value, and it would also return conference FITC. And if there's no more things to iterate, it will throw a stop iteration exception. Now, this is very verbose, right? I don't want to keep calling next, okay? Well, the nice thing is that we're also introducing a for in loop function. And this is going to call next for you automatically whenever you use it with an iterator. So as opposed to writing a for loop with by calling next every single time, you can just say for in this iterator do this. You can also use it with arrays. And this is very powerful as well. Let's say that I have an array of all the evangelists that are here at FITC. There's me, there's Nikki who's going to be around today, and then there's my boss, Tommy Lee, who's hanging out today too. If I had this array and I wanted to iterate through it, I would go do the same thing. I would go, hey, create an iterator for this evangelist list. And I can create a for loop. And what's really cool is I can use the let statement, destructure it, so that every single time for in iterator, it will destructure that pair and put it in index and item. And then I could just go ahead and say, hey, console.log, index plus item, that's going to print 0 and at Rami Sayar. So all of a sudden, I'm using the let declaration, I'm using destructuring, my new for in feature, and my iterator to make a piece of code that iterates through the array while keeping the index and getting the item in one shot. Pretty cool, right? Yeah? Yeah. So that's what an iterator is. What's a generator? A generator is basically a factory for iterators. It would make sense. It sounds similar, right? Like iterators, generators, if you can say it 5 times fast, then without messing it up, you can't. That's awesome. I can't. A generator is basically a function that continues execution whenever next is called. And it saves the context for every single time next is called so that we can re-enter and reuse the generator. So if you're a Python programmer, you're very familiar with generators. And with this new feature, we're also introducing a couple of new keywords, function star and yield. Now the neat thing, and why generators are really powerful, is that you can also use them to replace callbacks. And there's a couple of really cool Node.js modules that are doing just that to make everyone's lives so much easier, and to avoid that callback hell that we all fall under. So what does it look like? Function foo, all right, I have that star. That's what says this is a generator. And then I'm going to yield. So for anyone who's going to use foo, this is going to be an iterator. Okay, you're going to get foo, and then to get the next value, you're going to call next. What's happening in my generator is that every single time someone calls next, I'm going to execute whatever code is in there until I hit a yield statement. And I'm going to yield 1 the first time. If someone calls next again, well, the only statement that follows yield 1 is yield 2. So I'm going to stop execution, okay, at that point, and return 2. And execution elsewhere in my JavaScript program will continue until I call next again on foo. And that's how it's going to work. So a generator, you can use it to, well, you can use it as a factory for iterators. That's how you create your iterator. And there's a lot of cool frameworks that are using generators. Among them is Koa. Any of you guys heard of Express and Node.js? I'm sure most of you have. Koa is a new web framework that's designed by the same team behind Express. And it aims to be a lot smaller, more expressive, more robust, and to be used as a foundation for web applications and APIs. So they're really focused on that. And the really neat thing is that it leverages generators to ditch callbacks and improve the error handling. So if you've ever built an Express.js app, you would have noticed there's like 20 different middleware that you need to add. Each got its own callback. If there's an error anywhere in the middleware stack, you have no idea where it is, and it's really hard to debug. And it's very hard to read and figure out what's going on. Well, with ECMAScript 6 generators, okay, the difference here is that you can pass a generator to all of the middleware. So basically, the whole concept of middleware is gone, and you're actually just using a generator. So if I have my traditional app.use, and I'm just trying to send a hello world, I pass it a generator, and in this case, there's no yield statement, so it'll execute all the way. But if we added a yield statement, it's going to stop execution of that middleware right at that point, and then it's going to continue up the stack, down the stack. And you don't need callbacks to that. Because if there's error, you yield right away, right, and you continue execution. So all that to say is that I really, really, really want it. It's like a cupcake. I'm looking at a cupcake, and I sort of really, really want it, right? Like, I want ECMAScript 6. So who has it? Well, happy to say that different browsers are already implementing different parts of it, okay? You've got IE and Project Spartan that have implemented the const, let, and block level function declaration. All right, Firefox has also implemented const. It has let if you use a flag, all right? Firefox is the only one so far to have implemented destructuring, okay? And then classes and generators, they're implemented quite well in Firefox, but sort of implemented in Chrome if you use a flag, and then there's IOJS if you use IOJS instead of Node, and also all that. So I'm really happy that Project Spartan has the let declaration. That makes me really happy. So if you're wondering, okay, well, I want to use all these ECMAScript 6 features, but I guess I need to sort of go back in time, right? Like, I got to have this ECMAScript 6 compiler to the JavaScript that's in browsers right now. So there's a couple of tools that you can use. Among them is Google Trustor. There's also Babel, which is a compiler for ECMAScript 6. And it has special support for JSX and React if you're using those frameworks. Okay? And there's also Continuum, which is actually really interesting because it's a ECMAScript 6 virtual machine, all right, that's written with ECMAScript 3. Right? So in theory, support goes all the way back to IE6. Yes! I guess. Well, that's actually important if you're in South Korea, apparently. But less so in North America. Well, that's just going back in time. I want to go to the future. Right? I want to go back to the future from back in time, right? Haha, no one got it. Well, there's a couple of tools. One is X to 6. So if you have ECMAScript 6 and below code, so something written in regular JavaScript, this will actually convert some of that to use some of the new features in ECMAScript 6. If you wanted a shim to implement the things that are missing in the browser, there's an ES6 shim as well. And let's say that I wanted to start using the module loader that exists that's coming in ECMAScript 6 as opposed to the ones that already exist right now. There's also something for that as well. And all this code is open source and available on GitHub, and you can get it. So I'm really excited about the future of JavaScript, and it's going to be a very exciting time. But this is just a taste of some of the other things that are coming. I've only covered block scoping, destructuring, module, classes, iterators, generators, but there's other features that are coming as well, and they're in the ECMAScript standard. And what's neat is that if you want to talk about some of the other stuff, I'll actually be here at the Microsoft Lounge right outside, and I'll be here at 4 p.m. today and tomorrow at 11 a.m. If you want to talk about the future of JavaScript, I'll very happily take all of your questions. And we've got some really awesome stickers of a ninja cat riding a horned steed that breathes fire. All right, if you want that sticker, or maybe even a t-shirt, come to our lounge. I'll be here today at 4, right after this talk. Thank you so much. So a lot of the code samples are already on a gist on GitHub, and if you want to get the slides, it's on SlideShare. I've included in the slides about 3 slides of just documentation that you could read. So definitely grab the slides. They're already online. And I've tweeted out the support, and I see a bunch of people taking pictures. That's one way to take it, too. We have time for questions, right? Yeah? Okay, so any questions? Okay. Hi. So you can mix the two together. It's not like var is not going away. It's both var and let. So if you wanted to scope something to the function level, all right, you would use var. But if you wanted to be a little bit more safe and just say, hey, I only want this block that has access to this variable, you would use let. It's not all or nothing. You can still use both. If there's a reason to still use var, that's a very good question. So I come from a different background, right? I come from a C and C++ and Python background. So for me, let is a much safer way to declare variables than var, because it scopes things to where I'm reading the code, right? So for me, the minute that let is supported on all browsers, that's the only thing I'm going to use, because it's way safer and there's no variables leaking anywhere else. But like, of course, having the var feature is really powerful as well, because you can just get these variables be created deep in your function calls, right, without having to know about it later. So it's very flexible in that way. You can add things to your variable execution. So it's still a really powerful feature of JavaScript. The only issue with it is that it's extremely misunderstood, right? Like, very few people don't realize that vars are not scoped to the block; they're scoped to the function. So they get all these bugs the minute they start writing things like var I multiple times in their code. And all of a sudden, their I starts at 10 as opposed to 0 for their for loops, right? So that's the issue with it, right? So with let, you save a lot of headaches debugging, but it's still a very powerful feature to have. And I wouldn't want it to go away, but I would use it less if I knew that I was scoping things right. Cool. Yes? So, good question. It was proposed, all right, at the last time I read the standard, the draft, okay, it hasn't been ratified yet, so it might come back. But it was dropped from the last draft that I saw. Okay, it was like too much. It's probably going to come in ECMAScript 7. Sorry. But I could be wrong. They could re-add it in the next month and a half, or more like the next 3 months, right? We don't know. Any other questions? I can't see if you're raising your hand. Okay, cool. I don't use Ember, so I haven't checked, but I wouldn't be surprised that they're, preparing for ECMAScript 6. And the guys that build Ember are really smart people, so I'm pretty sure they know, they're ready for it, and they've announced something for it. I do know that Angular 2 is going to be written in ECMAScript 6 completely, with our support with TypeScript. That's a superset of JavaScript that's developed by Microsoft, so Angular 2 and TypeScript are going to come together. React has announced support for classes, so you'll be able to inherit things in React. So I haven't paid attention to the Ember news, unfortunately. Any more questions in the back? Maybe I can't see if you're... Okay, I can't see. Where are you? I still can't see you. Okay. Oh, there you are. I can hear you. Okay, Ghost, go. Yeah. Yes. I will double check though, but I believe so. The diff, I think, might be very strict in the class situation. But if you're using object literals, you can redefine it, I think. I will double check. We can talk about it outside if you like. Anyone else? I can't see. Yeah. Because the standard is not ratified yet, it's not a standard. But what's really neat is that a lot of the browser vendors have picked up the different ECMAScript 6 features that are coming. Okay, like we have with Project Spartan, we have a lot of support for almost all of the new standards that are coming. But the minute that it's ratified, that's when you'll actually see it appearing in all of the browsers without a flag. But if you download Project Spartan now, you can actually run it. It's pretty cool. Any other questions? Oh, we have 0 minutes. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. That's my coordinates on GitHub, Twitter, the slides you can get. I'll happily take more questions if you got some.